In addition to thinking about what compassion is, if we're going to be compassionate in the world, if we're actually going to be able to sustain that over time, I think we need to think about how we can create the causes and conditions in our lives that allow us to do that. So, compassion is really about what we do when we meet suffering or pain or discomfort. And um, instead of turning away from it or avoiding it or even condemning ourselves or the beings that are suffering for their suffering, it's about really turning toward suffering with sensitivity and kindness and the willingness to look deeply into it so that we can understand the causes and conditions that maintain it and then hopefully do something that would be helpful. But that requires us to be willing to be uncomfortable ourselves. It requires us to turn toward things that may be heartbreaking for us. And I think if we're to do that over time, if we're going to continue to turn toward difficulty and discomfort and tragedy over time and sustain ourselves, we need to think about how we're going to take care of ourselves in order to do that in a sustained way. And I think there are just two aspects of that I want to talk about just briefly today. I'm here in a Buddhist monastery, and if you're a Buddhist monastic, you'll be very well aware of the precepts that sort of govern how aspects of how you live your life as a monastic. And I think I've learned a lot from the Buddhist precepts because I think it's a really nice recipe for how you build a lifestyle that supports a body and mind to be able to be strong in continually meeting difficulty really courageously. So even the basic things like getting reasonable amounts of sleep, eating healthy foods rather than processed junk, right? Moving your body, right? So your body's healthy, and a healthy body supports a healthy mind. So these are basic things that I think a lot of times when people think about compassion, they don't think about that. They don't think about diet and exercise and sleep. But if we don't do those things, we'll very rapidly find out that mentally we're not going to be in the best place when that happens. So when we come into face to face with things that are difficult or heartbreaking, it'll be much easier for us to disappear into threatening emotions and things like that. And we'll have a hard time being centered as we meet those. I think the other part of it really is supporting our minds and supporting ourselves emotionally. When we move into states of threat, when experiences of fear or anger or things like this come up in us, there can be very powerful pulls for our attention to narrow and our thinking and reasoning to narrow and to be centered on the threat, which can motivate us, but it also cripples us. It makes it very hard for us to think reflectively and creatively about what would be helpful. It makes it very hard for us to do things like perspective taking, imagining the positions and the mindset of the other people involved in the situation, both the people that are being harmed and also the people that are maintaining the problem, right? So one of the things we need to do is find ways for us to remain centered in the midst of the storm. And in my experience, so much of that is about creating the supports that enable that. And that includes things like Sangha, being a part of a community of people who are connected and who accept one another and who support one another in this work. We know there's loads of science that shows that we feel much safer through connection with people that accept us and support us and perhaps even who share our vision. And there are other things we can do in terms of developing practices of meditation, right? Learning to work with our breath and our bodies and our minds. And so I guess what I wanted to say today is to encourage everyone to consider, what would the compassionate version of me, the version of me that's kind and wise and confident and courageous. What supports could I build in my life to set the stage for that version of me to show up even when I come into contact with things that break my heart? Right? How could I support that version of me to be present? And so I'd encourage you just to think about that and to like notice in your life when you're able to do that and the supports that are there at those times. So thanks so much.
I have to say, Russell, when you said keeping the precepts and then you said eating and resting and sleeping, for us it's that, and besides not harming any living being with our body, speech, and mind, and as far as our speech and stuff. So that, I think, not only takes care of ourselves, but I think that's, for me, my practice about just keeping the 10 virtues and avoiding the 10 non-virtues with my speech and my body and my mind helps me to get kind of clear about, well, if I'm going to meet suffering with courage and kindness, I have to make sure that I'm not creating it from my own side and contributing to it to the world. So I just wanted to add that as an extra. When you said precepts, to just explain for me what that means is my contribution to world peace and to compassion is cleaning up my act, making sure that I'm contributing to compassion in the world myself.
Absolutely. Well, and we can. Oh, sorry. Absolutely. And, we could, I'm sure you've had multiple day teachings on the precepts. If you even begin looking at the precepts and the depth to which they support compassion in the world, in our lives, and in the lives of our fellow practitioners. The other thing, I think everything you said was so important. The other thing that came to mind for me is that precept of not harming. And the effort and the thought that you put into doing that helps keep that compassion intent and that motivation present in our minds, right? So that it's there. It's not like something we think about every once in a while, but it's a part of the fabric of the way you are in the world on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, moment-to-moment basis. And I think that's really important, right? That motivation and intention, because it all flows from that.
I was thinking about the expression things that break your heart, and thinking that when you remained a balanced person, the things that used to break your heart no longer break your heart. Because to me, breaking your heart means you're so overwhelmed that you actually can't do anything helpful in the situation. Yeah. So I think this all leads up to facing things, but they don't break your heart anymore. But you still have compassion.
Yeah. And I think when I said break your heart, I was speaking a little differently in the terms of not thinking of it as when you're incapacitated by it, but when you hit it and you get that heart sink feeling, that, oh, right. But it doesn't incapacitate. In fact, it informs you about the experience and the situation others are having. But I think that's so important. And really that gets at the heart of what I was trying to say. How do you use the practice to keep yourself from getting incapacitated in those moments? So important. This is great. I wish we could just sit here and have these discussions for a really long time. Cool. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
It might be a year if I don't ask it now. So what you're describing a little bit there, that first moment sounds to me like a moment of empathy where you're experiencing maybe to a degree what that other person is.
I wouldn't say empathy. I think one of the problems, I think there's a problem in how we talk about empathy sometimes.
Okay, let me ask you my second question,
Okay.
and you can answer both together.
Yeah.
Because we learned recently from a person here that there was some psychological research showing that empathy I'll put it in my words, seemed like it kind of debilitated the person who had the empathy after a while, because it kind of, they were resonating, they were vibrating in the same way that the troubled
Yeah,
person was when
yeah.
they were then in trouble, versus having compassion. So I wondered if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I honestly think both of those observations are based in a misunderstanding or maybe a mischaracterization of empathy. I think the way we talk about empathy sometimes is not the best. I've heard a lot of people, and I'm sure I used to say this myself a lot, would talk about empathy as feeling with the other person, right? Or feeling what they're feeling. And actually, I think that that's problematic. I think it's problematic because it would lead to burnout, right? If every time I'm interacting with someone who's suffering, I'm feeling everything they're feeling. I'm not just feeling my suffering, I'm feeling my suffering and the suffering that, it's multiplied by everyone I help. I mean, we could see how that would be incapacitating. But it's also kind of an arrogant thing to assume that I can feel what you feel, right? Now, we do have these cells in the brain called mirror neurons. And there's research that shows that if I'm with someone who's feeling something, I'll feel a reflection of that. I'll get a bit of that. But to assume that my sadness is the same as your sadness, or what anxiety is like to me is the same as you, I don't think we can ever really feel what the other person is feeling. And if I base my understanding of what you're feeling based on what I'm feeling, I'm likely to be wrong, right? Because there's this whole host of assumptions and background and context that shows up around those feelings in my life that may be entirely different to how that shows up in your life. So I think a much better way to think of empathy is working to cultivate an understanding of the other person's emotional experience. So there's this, again, a small emotional component because we've got that resonance, but the much larger part of it is trying to really understand from their side, what is this experience like? What is the emotions, the felt experience? And also, we can even extend empathy to maybe even trying to understand how it makes sense that they would have that experience from their side in their context. So I think actually talking about empathy as feeling with or being a primarily emotional experience is problematic on a whole lot of levels. And so I think much more helpful to think of it in terms of trying to cultivate an understanding.